Good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming out on day two, first presentation of the day. My name is Paul Creer. I'm the Technical Director for Cybersecurity Architecture and Engineering for Enterprise Services for RTX. And today I'll be talking a little bit about our journey through vulnerability discovery. Standard disclaimer, I'm not a sales guy. I've got no AIs for you today. I'm not even here to tell you how to do things. I'm just here to go over some of the ideas and big thoughts that we've had over a decade of kind of looking at this problem space. First off, just a little context about RTX. The name is fairly new. I think it's from July of last year, one of several we've had in the last couple of years with our recent merger between United Technology and Raytheon. We are the world's largest aerospace defense company. You've probably heard of our business units, Collins Aerospace, Pratt & Whitney, and Raytheon. We do aviation, integrated defense systems. We build jet engines, we build bathrooms for airplanes, infotainment systems, satellites, integrated circuits. A bunch of different things come out of our manufacturing lines. We have a global footprint. I believe we're in 90 different countries around the world, 185,000 employees, about 585,000 hosts we try and secure in some way or fashion. As I mentioned, we merged in 2020. That was a significant event for us. Two rather large companies coming together to form an even bigger company and then casting off several other pieces. So we divested Carrier and Otis, and many of you here probably have heard of ForcePoint. That was a Raytheon business for a while. And amongst all of this, internally, we were also trying to reorganize. Raytheon, for instance, had 4 business units and has gone down to 1. Lots of different projects to kind of integrate all of these different companies, all these different pieces together. And that has made things difficult, complex, I guess, for our vulnerability management program and how we see ourselves in the world. I started with Raytheon 13 years ago, and at that time, our focus was on our perimeter, right? Strong outer shell, soft GUI center. I think that's kind of the metaphor a lot of folks use. As we have evolved, we've taken a bigger perspective when it comes to what it is we have to secure. We're looking outside of our perimeter now, beyond the extents of our data centers, and seeing that we have this, what we term the extended enterprise. This extended enterprise is our subsidiaries. We do a lot of acquisitions, right? And some of those are integrated fairly quickly. Some of them take years to get integrated. We have joint ventures. We have suppliers, both indirect and direct. We have SaaS services now. All of these things are assets, are enablers that we need to understand the risk of and figure out ways of securing and kind of how they factor into our vulnerability program. And then, of course, 4 years ago, all of a sudden, we're all working from home, and that perimeter kind of dissolved a great deal, right? We're facing a lot of new challenges as we try and connect and enable a remote workforce, and that is particularly difficult when you're a manufacturing company, when you deal with classified systems, when you have to have people in SCIFs doing work. And so we've seen this kind of breakdown in the perimeter and how that has impacted our perception of vulnerability management. Why you should care? Hopefully you're here, you've invested the time to come here this morning. One of the first things is to understand your risk, right? If you're just looking at your perimeter, you're missing out on a bigger picture. There's a lot of things out there that need to factor in, and your vulnerability management process kind of becomes, at least ours, has become a clearinghouse for problems. A lot of what we had focused on prior to this was, scanning and fixing things that we find. But beyond that, there are these other issues that lurk out there, and that we have to have a process for collecting and managing through to remediation. And so by looking larger, you start to understand this risk and be able to measure it. Manage all of your assets. When we first kind of came into this problem space, or when I first came into this problem space, we were thinking in terms of the laptops, the servers, the physical, tangible things that we can touch. We now understand that we have these digital assets out there that are very valuable, not just in terms of their monetary value. A Class B ARIN record of 65,000 consecutive IP addresses that can sell for $3 million, right? A three-letter .com domain, that's a $1 million asset, all right? And so knowing those assets exist and managing them as if they had, recognizing that value and managing them as valuable assets on your books can be an important discovery as part of this process. Allows you to respond more quickly. Developing this bigger picture, you develop these relationships with these subsidiaries, with these joint ventures, with these partners, so that you understand who to talk to, how they're configured. You start to define what these things look like, how the data is moving back and forth, what type of data is there. And so that information can be brought to bear if there is a need for an incident response. Manage your reputation. This one has come to light within the last year for us, not a light, but a priority for us in the last year. Cyber insurance premiums are going up. It's based a lot on these reputational scores. We've had a lot of customers or business partners coming to us with reports from third parties saying, hey, you've got a low score here for this or that. That part of the reputation is important. Understanding that reputation is out there, kind of like your credit report is there. That reputation is preceding you and is sometimes the only bit of information, the only representation you have in a conversation that you don't even know is happening. So understanding the reputation can lead to better outcomes when you're asked tough questions by your leadership. And then finally, understanding your responsibility to respond. If you haven't asked these questions, we have joint ventures with other parties, right? And each one of those joint ventures, it turns out, is kind of a unique snowflake. Sometimes we have a responsibility there to help secure the digital technology within that joint venture. Sometimes it's not our responsibility at all. And so as we come across these things, we understand that we have to start asking these questions and be better able to respond and understand what our role will be if we discover something that needs remediation. Kind of look at our journey as a lesson in cartography. In phase one, we're a villager in a medieval village, right? We know the ins and outs of our village like the back of our hands. We know the people, we know the streets, we know the details of our immediate surroundings. But beyond that, our worldview is rather limited. Then we move into the concept of the lay of the land. We might see some folks visiting in our marketplace, right? That are bringing technologies, that have gadgets, that have new linens with new colors, right? That are interesting to us. They have new ideas, new concepts that we need to kind of understand and bring into our worldview. So we start to see that the world is a bigger place. Then, as we adopt that, we understand that we have these outposts that are ours, that we count on, that we need to secure now. And this is the empire phase. And so as we move into that phase, our world picture is solidifying, but then we have to keep up. Our perspective with regard to cybersecurity has to kind of evolve as well. And then we move into actualization, where we have that understanding, we're using it in order to protect those outlying outposts in a way that makes sense given their relationship to us. So phase one, home turf. What does this look like in terms of vulnerability management? There's a focus on the perimeter, right? I think we all kind of start there. At least that's where we started. It's very clear what it is you have to defend. You're looking at the inside of your environment. You're scanning. You're trying to assign ownership, and you're trying to work through and prioritize the issues in a way that makes sense, because you're flooding in those issues typically. Your approach to scanning is usually one size fits all. You're going to scan it all and then action what comes out of that. This seems fairly basic, but there are a couple of key points, and the reason we separate this out in this way is what I have seen is that vulnerability discovery and host and service discovery sometimes get slammed together in one big box. You use your scanner to find the hosts, the ports that are open, and then you try and identify any vulnerabilities. What we have done is tried to consciously separate out those two processes, right? Host and service discovery can be its own thing. It can have its own approach. It can have its own mission area, inputs and outputs, right? For instance, have you considered using NetFlows as a means of discovering new services? You don't have to scan everything in order to discover that there are other things on your network that need to be addressed. What about route advertisements to understand how the fabric of your network is changing? There are other bits of information that you might be excluding because you haven't considered host and service discovery its own sort of process. With vulnerability discovery, are you leveraging all of the different sources of vulnerability information that there is, right? A lot of people just focus on the scanner. The scanner is telling me what I need to know about. But are you looking into Active Directory? Are there other things that you can kind of pull together in order to find new and novel, interesting vulnerabilities? The risk rating process, right? You can't possibly fix everything that your scanners or your vulnerability discovery process is telling you about. And so what process do you have to prioritize those findings? Taking consideration the context of where it was found, that host, is it externally exposed? Does it have super sensitive data on it? How is it being, where is it in the world, and what sort of restrictions are around it? And what are the findings about, is that vulnerability being exploited currently? Is it even relevant to you? What is the severity? Those sorts of things go into that risk rating bucket to help you prioritize and come up with a means of, at scale, creating a list of things that need to be actioned. And then that feeds forward into this mitigation process, and we've divided that into two because we just realized that there are certain things, and it's not always clear why, that catch the eye of leadership, right? Some of the things make it into the news, and board of directors is asking about it, and CISO is asking about it. And so those things need additional attention. They require their own kind of white glove approach through mitigation, through burn down, through to completion, versus the standard approach to mitigation, which is more of an ongoing sort of sustained effort. And over all of this, there's this vulnerability analysis process, right? Where you're tuning each one of these, you're weeding out the false positives from your vulnerability discovery. You're tweaking the context information in your risk rating. You're better understanding how and why, what your leadership cares about, so you're better prioritizing the mitigation efforts and making sure that the right approach is taken to those activities. Moving into phase two, lay of the land. Some of the characteristics here, right, are you're starting to understand your extended enterprise. You're looking beyond your perimeter and seeing these things out there that you should that you need to care about. You're starting to kind of collect and understand the seed data, the domains, the IP ranges, the other information that kind of help you understand what your cyber presence is. You might be starting to experiment with attack surface management. And what I have found is this, I came from a pen testing background, This is kind of the application of the reconnaissance phase of your pen tests, where they're going out and discovering the targeting for an assessment and pulling that stuff together in order to kind of kick off an assessment. With attack surface management, you're doing that at scale continually. You're using those same techniques, but you're using them in a way that's automated. And then finally, you're possibly realizing the flaws in commodity scanning. So the complexity of that scanning, the complexity of the applications you're finding or discovering against those, especially when you start to look outside, tend to have complex architectures. You have content delivery networks, load balancers, federated SSO for identity. Those systems are cobbled together in a way that makes it difficult if you don't understand and take a bespoke approach to those applications, that you're going to be missing some things in terms of what you're covering with your vulnerability discovery process. And so you're starting to understand that and take that into consideration. The next idea, I think, that was somewhat interesting for us is this taxonomy we broke down. I think we started with IP addresses, or we scanned all of the things and basically associated our findings with an IP address. But then we came up with the idea of the concept of these digital assets and needing to use those digital assets as a means of discovering more stuff, looking beyond what we knew about to kind of look into the cloud, look at our subsidiaries, look beyond our data centers and our immediate perimeter in order to find more things. This led into the fully qualified domain name, the FQDN, as a means of associating vulnerabilities against, because now we're finding applications that are not just an IP address, that there are a mix of 5 or 6 different IP addresses with different roles in this application. And it's very hard to kind of reflect that when all you're thinking about is an IP address. And so as we look at those, we're starting to think about these systems, right? These applications that are complicated, that have an interesting architecture there that need to be understood and represented in the process. That led us into the web entity. We have, for us, RTX, we have about 13,000 web entities that our attack surface management system is telling us about right now. But those are basically any service, any port that's providing some sort of HTTP response. And that HTTP is an interesting approach to focus on, but what we have found is that across the internet, that's where most of the logic is communicated across that protocol. So calling those out individually as an entity, as a part of our taxonomy was helpful for us. But what we realize is about 2/3 of those web entities are not particularly interesting. A lot of them are doing 301 redirects to something else. Port 80 is redirecting to port 443. That's not helpful when we're trying to understand the complexities of a web application. And so that's where we came up with the concept of a web application as having multiple web entities that are entry points into that web application. And so we can now model these things in that way so that we can keep track of them and understand where we should be focusing our efforts. So this led us, developing and understanding this taxonomy led us to the realization that this process needed to be customized. We can't use the same process internally as we use externally. While the boxes look the same, what's in those boxes for external versus internal is completely different. Internally, we might use net flows and scanning and our IPAM database to discover hosts and services. Externally, we're using DNS and certificate transparency logs and other people's scanning databases in order to kind of discover hosts, right? Internally, we're focused on vulnerability scanning. Externally, we're kind of reaching out to other types of cloud scanning and pulling out other tools to kind of do that discovery, that vulnerability discovery bit. Internally, the risk rating process is simpler. We understand the context better. We understand the specifics of that finding. Externally, we might not have as much context, and so we're having to kind of rely on other information as we try and prioritize those findings. We spent a lot of time in this phase talking about attack surface management. And some of the fundamentals here are the seed data, right? Domains, IP ranges, autonomous system numbers, which is an ID used in the border gateway protocol for routing across the internet outside of your perimeter. All of those are important and kind of table stakes in terms of understanding what your presence on the internet is. But then we started to dive into our corporate entities, right? We have this massive structure of legal entities that exist where RTX is kind of at the root, and the business units and then the subsidiaries underneath them. And when we went in to start mining that information, what we found is there's this history, this long legacy of acquisitions and divestitures, and these operating structures that have meaning, that have information that we can tease out in order to feed into this. Old brands, old domains, old company names that are all useful in helping us better understand the context when we discover something is associated with us. Certificates, right? We don't use those necessarily for discovery directly, but as we discover new certificates, we then mine that information in order to find more domains using the alternate names and things like that off of the certificates. And so this information allows us to discover our internet presence, and that feeds forward into this disposition process. This disposition process allows us to continually review the new hosts, the new things that are being associated with us, and mine that for more information. What we usually do is take that host information and first make a determination based on how it was associated with us, whether it's a true positive or a false positive, right? And we do see false positives. We can't control somebody pointing an A record into one of our IP ranges on a domain that we don't own. So there are those types of things that pop up and that we have to address. But as we associate and show that we do own this asset, our first task is to determine ownership. What we're looking there is for kind of coarse brushstrokes. Is it what business unit, what subsidiary? Give us some detail about who to go and ask about this thing if it's not directly clear. And then the next step after we've done that ownership step is to kind of mine that information, mine that finding for other seed data, right? Is that telling us about some new IP range that is now in scope for us? Is it telling us about some domain that we were previously unaware of based on some other name on a certificate? All of those details can be very helpful in helping us to expand our understanding of our internet presence. If it's not associated, then why is the system telling us about it? Is there something that we could do to tune this? Maybe we divested or sold off a portion of the company and an IP range is no longer being used. Maybe we allowed a domain to expire, and that's still being discovered against. And so those are the sorts of details that we can use to tune this system so that it's telling us about the things that we need to know about with as few false positives as possible. And then that information is fed forward into the vulnerability discovery process. So another process is kicked in here to go in and look at those systems in order to determine what they are and how they're postured. Some of the lessons from attack surface management: it is much easier to find hosts than it is to find that seed data, those digital assets. We spent a long time kind of developing that history, going back through and looking through those corporate entities, looking through our understanding of ourselves and our business units in order to kind of pick out those digital assets and start tracking them in a meaningful way. The discovery process is a feedback loop, as I discussed in the last slide, right? You have to mine that data to make sure that the system is staying tuned to what you're looking for, to what is relevant. The tools tell you about your current attack surface. They don't do a good job of telling you about your history, right? And so as you decommission a system, as you delete a DNS record, right, your attack surface changes, and those things that were associated that way will disappear. And if you don't have another means of tracking that history, it's no longer available to you. So we've created a separate database that allows us to track some of that, especially for the domains and the seed data, the domains, the ranges, the ASNs, right? And that database allows us to say what's currently in scope and what is out of scope. And the reason that is important is it avoids duplication of effort. If I've looked at this thing before, I don't want to have to look at it again and do the same amount of research. I want to capture that and make sure it's available for the next analyst. But the other thing that has been exceedingly useful is the fact that we now have some history on those assets, how they were used. We've had instances where external parties have come to us and offered us money for a domain or for a range, right? And if we don't understand how it was used, it's very hard to understand what the risk is of selling that asset, and what sort of trust was established with that domain. If it was the primary email domain for a subsidiary with hundreds of thousands of customers relying on it on a regular basis, and when was it decommissioned? And does that trust still exist? Is there still an expectation by customers or business partners that we're defending that domain? Or is this something that we parked a decade ago and have never actually used and can now monetize? That information is hugely useful in making those types of decisions. A lot of the attack surface tools that I've explored, they don't really implement RBAC, role-based access control. We have we're fortunate in that we have a large team that is leveraging the attack surface management tools in the external discovery platform. And so it has become more important that we're able to manage the roles in there. For us, there's this analyst role and there's this knowledge manager role. The analyst is kind of running that disposition process and trying to explore and expand our understanding of our presence. The knowledge manager is maintaining the seed data. It's excluding and tuning the system. It's providing saved queries to find stuff easier. And right now, a lot of the tools aren't allowing us to distinguish between those two roles, and so we've had to compensate for that in other ways. A lot of the tools tend to focus on host risks and are missing some of the other types of risks that are out there. I can get host risks. I'm passing all of this stuff forward into a vulnerability discovery process that I trust and we spent a lot of time around. So the host risks I'm not as interested in. Sometimes it's helpful as a triage to have all of that in one place, but for the most part, what I would really like to see more of is the type of risks that aren't kind of found by scanning, right? The idea that we're not managing our ARIN records in a standardized way. We don't have a standard approach for our DKIM records for email spoofing. Those are the sorts of things that are systematic kind of findings that I think are more interesting from an attack surface management tool than you're running an end-of-life operating system. And so I've encouraged our vendors and the other folks in this space that I've spoken to kind of think more, think bigger in this area. For us as a defense contractor, not a lot of these tools are FedRAMPed, which means it becomes difficult to use all of the capabilities that they're providing to us. A lot of those tools provide capabilities to kind of annotate and keep track and put notes into the system as you discover stuff and refine and add data to that portal. But because they're not FedRAMP, we can't use all of those capabilities. And then the final lesson, this was kind of this is still one we're discussing, but third-party risk scores use a lot of the same tactics as attack surface management tools. You know, they're scanning things, they're certificate transparency logs, DNS, passive DNS. They're looking at a lot of the same things, but with a third-party risk scorer, they're trying to score you based at scale. They're trying to do this with as little input from the scored entity as possible so that they can scale out and provide a score for as many people as possible. Whereas the attack surface management tool is a tool that you're using to understand your attack surface. And so while they overlap in the techniques, the mission is differently. And what we've found is several of the third-party risk scorers are trying to sell themselves as our attack surface management tool. But the problem that I have with that is if you follow those findings, if you follow the path that you get from the third-party risk scorers, you're going to go in a direction that they think is important, not necessarily the direction that you think is important. You know, a lot of them are focusing on like TLS misconfigurations on brochure websites and stuff like that as significant findings. It's important, it's interesting, but I wouldn't say it's significant. And so being able to kind of tune that approach to your risk appetite, I find is an important concept that you need to keep in mind as you're looking at these tools. Moving on into phase 3, Empire, right? Now you've kind of understand that the extended enterprise, or whatever name you use for it, is a thing. You've got these outposts out there that you know you have a responsibility to protect. And you're trying to extend your security envelope out across all of these important assets. There are certain characteristics that we've seen here. At this point, you've probably charted and understand a lot of these different types of external entities that are yours to protect. You understand where they're at, not necessarily how they're configured, perhaps. You're starting to define that responsibility model. What is your responsibility to defend a subsidiary that is responsible for implementing your policies but isn't able to consume your enterprise services? That's something that we struggle with. We're growing beyond the host and application defects. We're starting to see cloud defects or these internet presence issues that need to be addressed, and needing to have systems that allow us to capture and describe those things and then assign them for remediation, which is much different than what we had been dealing with when we were talking about, you know, a vulnerability scan and a finding against a particular IP address. You're starting to kind of feel the complexities of your attack surface. You know, those content delivery networks, the S3 buckets, all of the different pieces that can go into an application become complicated when you're trying to figure out good ways of discovering the vulnerabilities associated with that system. And so how you begin to address those complexities is part of this phase. Talked about a little bit about responsibility tiers. This is kind of roughly how we have broken it out. This probably doesn't necessarily apply to everybody here, but it gives you an example of what to think about. At the close in, right, your primary back office. This is your intranet or intranets, right? Centrally managed hosts on a centrally managed network. Pretty straightforward. Then for us, we have segmented back office. These are centrally managed hosts on networks that are kind of have unique compliance requirements, data sovereignty issues. This is our landed companies in the UK and Australia. They have their own, Ministry of Defense and different compliance requirements about who can access what data. And so we have to kind of factor that in as we're building out these discovery processes. We have product networks where we're delivering digital services to customers, to external customers. This has become a really interesting spot for us. As primarily a manufacturing company, we typically, for most of our life, have made things and shipped them out, and it's somebody else's job to use them, to deploy them, whatever. Now we're starting to make these digital services and provide them in our data centers for external parties to consume. And so that leads to interesting discussions about how do we protect that. There are different security architectures, there are different assumptions that an incident responder would need to bring with them as they look at, as they do response or investigations in these particular areas. And so that product space becomes really kind of interesting for us as a manufacturing company. We have disconnected back offices, back office networks. These would be like our subsidiaries that are in the process of integrating but haven't quite integrated. And so how do we handle them? How do we understand where they're at in this integration process? So we're helping them out. We're kind of guiding them into a better place, but that we're also understanding what their current capabilities are in terms of consuming some of the services that we can offer them. We have, as a contractor, we have customers, right? Where we deploy systems and we have to maintain a system on somebody else's network. That becomes interesting. We have to understand those responsibilities and how we go about kind of trying to secure those, especially when they're exposed to the internet. Shared responsibility, I've talked a lot about like joint ventures and these things where we're working with other partners to kind of secure, and it's not always clear who has what responsibility there. And then our business partners, right? We have suppliers, we have SaaS tools, we have investments in startups that we have a stake in, that we have some responsibility for monitoring and securing and providing guidance to occasionally, but that the onus of securing them aren't directly on us. And so understanding this responsibility tiers and how that plays into the services that you're offering can be pretty important. Moving into phase 4, actualization. Now we understand that the extended enterprise is there, that we have these outposts that we need to protect. We're starting to embrace the complexities of this. And by the way, I don't think we're at this phase. We're working up to this phase. We're talking about what this is and means, but it's through these conversations that we begin to prepare and identify that this is even a thing that we should be thinking about. We're starting to operationalize this term called assurance domains. These are things, areas where defects exist that we've seen, we kind of got these anecdotes about. We've got particular instances of findings of defects, but now we have to kind of capture that in a way that allows us to define and understand them better and create processes to address them. And then we're just starting to tailor vulnerability discovery. What are we doing there to find these vulnerabilities when we have these complex systems and have to kind of understand how things are interconnected? So when I talk about tailoring, I think I had many conversations with the manager of our vulnerability management team, and his ears start to kind of smoke when we have this conversation, right? He's really focused on scanning everything on the internal network, all of the things, all of the time, as quickly as possible, and figuring out who owns what and making sure that those critical vulnerabilities are getting the attention they need. So we have these conversations about what are the differences here. Internally, we have tens or hundreds of thousands of hosts. Externally, even a company the size of RTX has thousands of entities to contend with. Internally, we're protected by a perimeter. We know where that edge is. Externally, everything is open to the world, and those perimeters kind of break down. There's no real fence around what it is we need to care about. Internally, generally, the applications are simpler. The audiences are more trusted. Externally, the applications are large. They're global. They have interesting connections. They have a global reach. The populations aren't as trusted. They can't be as trusted. Internally, systems are hopefully well documented to some extent. Maybe in your CMDB, maybe in other sources that you've integrated into this process. Externally, you're finding stuff at subsidiaries, at joint ventures, all over the place that you don't necessarily understand how they're connected in. Internally, most of the things are in data centers or in client lands, wherever. Externally, you've got this complicated situation where you have content delivery networks kind of caching stuff around the globe. You have these federations of identity that you need to connect into and understand. You have the cloud where everybody's spinning up things instantaneously and then they're disappearing almost as quickly. And you have these software as a service systems that your company is relying on because they don't want to host things anymore. At least ours doesn't. And so these are all adding to the complexity of the external pieces here. Internally, the responsibility is quite clear. Externally, the complexity of the responsibility is difficult. There's interesting conversations there that have to be had before you can just jump into something. And so the reason I bring this up is my hypothesis is externally, because you don't have to scale as big, but complexity is quite higher, you can afford to take a more bespoke approach to vulnerability discovery. You can afford to understand the high-level architecture, how that CDN is replicating data, how that how that static or how that S3 bucket is serving up static content, and how that's configured, and build ways of understanding and discovering vulnerabilities within these complicated environments using multiple technologies in order to make sure that you've covered all of the ground. Whereas internally, you gotta scale to hundreds of thousands, if not more. The last kind of big idea that we're working through is these assurance domains. And this is the list of some of the things that we've talked about. I think hosts and applications are pretty clear, cut and dry sort of things that we've been thinking about for years. Now we're seeing, especially with the cloud, identity and permissions within the cloud as being a core area that we're concerned about, a core area of risk. And so how do we reflect, how do we identify the identities? What is the equivalent of host and service discovery for identity? And then how do we track and monitor, discover new vulnerabilities against identity that is informative, that allows us to have a conversation with our cloud teams or cloud developers to make sure that those identities are being used and appropriately and secured. Cloud, obviously, how do we discover those vulnerabilities and track them? I can no longer, associate that defect with an IP address. I might have to associate it with a tenant or a subscription or an account of some sort. So the data model needs to change for those, and we need to be able to include that and figure out what our audience is for those types of vulnerabilities. Factory OT has been a growing area where we're maturing quite quickly, but we've had to put a lot of thought around that. So the idea here around assurance domains is not this list. Your list may be completely different. However, the idea is you're thinking about assurance domains, you're trying to discover and maybe creating a backlog of those things. I think there's something here. There's some new type of defect that we're talking about. What are the common characteristics of this defect? Can I define an assurance domain around that? And then where does that fit on my priority list? Where does that fit within my tooling? Do I have a means of tracking that? What would that look like? So by talking about this in terms of assurance domains, you start a process where you can expand beyond kind of these well-worn trails that we've been on for the last decade or so. So that was the last big idea. What can you do with this information? So within the next week, some of the things that you might consider doing is identifying your digital assets, starting to look at that so that you building those lists and understanding where your digital assets lie, how they're being managed. Within the first 3 months, you might think about looking at your vulnerability management process and seeing what sort of assumptions are there. How are you doing risk rating? What sort of inputs go into that calculation? How are you discovering hosts? Are you relying on The fact that you know all of the ranges where you should find stuff. Could there be other ranges out there? Does your process take that into consideration? How are you prioritizing remediation? These are some of the questions you should be asking as you look at that process and seeing if it has the capability to grow and mature. Within 3 months, you might start thinking about tracking your digital assets. You begin to build these lists, at least we did. They started off in spreadsheets on my desktop, and they've expanded into a database of information that's plugged into different information sources, right? So I can track things that are coming in, new ideas, new concepts, new deals, right? And then that information can feed forward into our cyber threat intel, to our SOC. When they have questions, they can kind of go back to this database and look at that. So tracking those digital assets can be helpful for many different reasons. And so building those lists and that process around it can be important. Within 6 months, centralized management of domains and RIR records, those ARIN, RIPE, APNIC records that you may have, making sure if you are fortunate enough to have a big enough IP space to have those records to actually own that space, making sure that you're managing that. What we've found is through years of acquisitions and divestitures, our records management has recently required a significant uplift. And then think about operationalizing attack surface management so that you have this knowledge and understanding of your internet presence and where you are in the world. So with that, I'll leave it open. Any questions, comments? Really, again, this is just some of the ideas that we've had. Happy to have this conversation with you either on LinkedIn, email, or I'll step out into the hallway. We don't have a ton. Oh, sir, yeah, go ahead.
Good morning, and thank you, Paul, for your insights. Questions around risk rating that you spoke of earlier, and how it differentiates for the prioritization of remediation as well. Could you give us some more insights around how do you think about, when you run a scan, vulnerability scan, you get a rating, right? You get some sort of a score to prioritize, but that doesn't necessarily correlate with the asset's relevance from an exploitability. So how have you gone about some of those elements? And I have one more, if you don't mind.
Sure. So that risk rating process, that box, right, is about using the context you have about both the specific finding, the vulnerability, is it being exploited, but also the context of that host. How do we do that at scale? Sometimes it's tagging, right? We're trying to tag those assets that are most important. We have, the Pratt business unit has a really good project around crown jewels and identifying assets that contain, that we consider our crown jewels. And so we can pull that information in from, that contextual information from the business units in order to help with that process. And so we've built processes that allow for that to some extent. But it is not easily done at scale.
Yeah.
I understand where the question is coming from.
Right, thank you. The other one that I wanted to check with you on the external scan, the attack surface that you spoke of. Yeah. There are a couple of problems that I foresee from my experience. One is these child domains getting sprung up, and then therefore the domain entry is getting created. So how have you gone about sort of, may I say, governing that layer? And then anybody can start a website by buying something on GoDaddy or what have you. Yeah. And how, because of the reputation at least involved, what's the sort of governance mechanism that you may have implemented or thought of that can help from an ASM perspective, if you don't mind?
Sure. So we have a lot of that where people use their corporate card to go and buy an asset. Corporate policy, right, is one way. The other way, you shouldn't do that, right? We want you to come through this. We've established enterprise services for purchasing domains, for purchasing certificates, right? So part of this is corporate policy. That's kind of the stick, don't do that or you're going to get in trouble. But the other part of it is the carrot of these enterprise services, making it easy and cheap for programs, for users to come in and consume, get those domains, get those certificates, and give us the ability to kind of secure them, right? They don't have to think about multi-factor authentication into the registrar. They don't have to think about DNSSEC. We'll take care of all of that for them if they use our service. Typo squatting, that's something that is built in if we know about it, if you've built that. So part of it is selling the service, advertising it, and making sure that users know, and making that experience easy and clearly a benefit for folks, so that you don't have to rely on that policy stick, which doesn't really work that well.
Thank you.
Cool. Okay. Oh, one more. All right.
Thank you for the presentation, by the way. I am from the A&D space as well, so I'm curious as to which ASM tools did you end up leveraging that met the FedRAMP requirements?
None of them met the FedRAMP requirements. So we use tools that don't meet the FedRAMP requirement, but we don't use the capabilities to push information up into that. So they're discovering stuff based on public information. And so I can talk to you after I'm not mic'd about the specific tools that we're using, but basically we're just very careful in what we push up there. We know that they're able to discover stuff based on public information. They're discovering it. We're not worried about that. It's the insider knowledge that we could push up there through notes or comments on particular assets that we're concerned about. That, and so we limit that use case.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you so much for your time this morning. Have a great conference. We'll hope to see you around.